Hello and welcome to my channel, IWinToLose Gaming. It's time for a DPS showdown, and today's contestants are the legendary 500-year-old Kitsune, Yae Miko, the Electro Archon herself Raiden, and a local girl that makes fireworks. So many of you might be surprised to see Yoimiya in this video. In a recent poll I did, I included Kaching as one of the characters for consideration for today's DPS showdown. Unfortunately, I forgot about one crucial thing that makes any sort of DPS showdown with Kaching really unfair for her, and that is my Constellation 6 Bennett. So I used my tyrannical authority of being the sole person making stuff for my YouTube channel and overthrew the democratically elected Kaching for the next runner-up, Yoimiya. Sorry Kaching, back to doing a bunch of paperwork for you. With that blunder of mine out of the way, it's that time of the DPS showdown where we familiarize ourselves with our contestants, their builds, their damage potentials, and more. Starting off in the super old and I didn't know foxes could live that long corner, we have the penultimate Shrine Maiden of the Grand Narukami Shrine, the one, the only, Yae Miko. Yae Miko is unsurprisingly sporting the ultimate cat toy at Refinement 5, and she is using the 2-piece gladiators and 2-piece Shimenawas. She's at Constellation 6 and her talents are notably at 6, 12, and 11, so do note that her talents have some room to grow. This puts her elemental skills damage potential at 75%. As usual though, I do balance out some damage potentials with various resonances and food, and her damage potential will range from 75% to 83% throughout this video. Next we have the Electro Archon herself. My Raiden is shockingly using the Engulfing Lightning and the 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fates. She's also at Constellation 6 and her talents are at 6, 12, and 13. While I do adjust my artifacts a bit for some crit fishing, generally she is around 80 to 85% damage potential throughout this video. And the third contestant who is unceremoniously dragged into this is none other than the local fireworks manufacturer, Yoimiya. Yoimiya is blowing up her enemies with a Refinement 5 Thundering Pulse, the 4-piece Shimenawas, and she is also at Constellation 6. Her talents are at 10, 12, and 12, and her damage potential ranges from 78% to 86% throughout this video. Now with the contestants lined up and raring to go, it's time for everyone's favorite part of the video, the disclaimers. All the runs in this video can be improved. I simply do each of these runs a few times and pick the best time for each of the situations. I'm not here to grind infinitely just to save a few frames to a few seconds. Each of these runs were done to the best of my abilities and problem solving within a reasonable amount of time. This is simply an anecdotal comparison between these characters and my levels of investment, and because these characters are all at Constellation 6 Refinement 5, this is not an accurate reflection of their power levels at lower constellations. Just because character A did better than character B in a specific scenario does not mean that character A is better than character B. Please take everything with a giant grain of salt. And with all that out of the way, we can finally get started by clobbering the most harmless of innocent volunteers, the Regisvines. Starting with the usual way I do the Regisvine showcase, I precast stuff. In this case, I precast 3 of Yae Miko's elemental skills during Bennett's elemental skills cooldown. This allows Yae to immediately use her elemental burst after Bennett breaks the Regisvine's orb, and then shock her plant friend into submission in just 3.2 seconds. As for Raiden, with her elemental skill boosting her burst's damage, she can run a higher crit rate build and have her elemental skill precasted. Then with a quick swipe right, Raiden effortlessly one-shots our poor Regisvine friend in a blistering 1.8 seconds. And since Yoimiya doesn't gain really anything from precasting, there is nothing for her to do prior to Bennett knocking the Regisvine down. Then Yoimiya is being Yoimiya by using her elemental skill to turn her arrows that tickle the enemy into arrows that murder the enemy. Yoimiya was just a smidge behind a precasting Yae Miko at 3.4 seconds. Now you might be wondering, wait, why are we murdering the Cryo Regisvine again? Unlike the last version where we were allowed to precast abilities, for this one we won't be precasting any abilities. Unfortunately, once precasting is out of the question, Yae Miko now needs to cast her elemental skill 3 times and then use her burst. This extremely tedious and grueling process took Yae Miko 5.3 seconds to take out the Regisvine. Now you might be wondering why I still used all 3 when it only took 2 Tenko Thunderbolts to kill the Regisvine, and this is because I need to wait for the first Kitsune turret to hit the Regisvine once, and that doesn't happen until right after the 3rd turret is casted. As for Yoimiya, well, she got the exact same time as the last run because it literally makes no difference to her whether she can precast her abilities or not. As for Raiden, because I'm unable to precast her elemental skill, all I have to do is slap on a bit more crit damage to still one-shot our poor plant friend. In this DPS showdown, Raiden is the unquestionable queen of chopping salad. We can finally move on from murdering innocent plants to instead murdering an innocent sleepy lizard, the Primo Geovishap. Yae Miko, despite being an off-field DPS character, is being used entirely on-field in this situation. And although her being on-field contributes almost nothing after she uses her stuff, she was still able to effortlessly perform shock therapy on her grouchy lizard friend in 16.8 seconds. Raiden has stunned us, or maybe not, all again by annihilating our poor lizard friend during a single burst duration. Another astounding victory for our favorite Electro Archon. Those that are more astute may have noticed that I poked the Primo Lizard's face with Yoimiya's charge shot to start, but despite using her charge shot and her burst at the end, unfortunately my Yoimiya at her current damage potential appears to be just shy of one cycling the Primo Geovishap. I tried this roughly a dozen times and each time she would be so close and yet so far. Yoimiya ended up resorting to her silly physical arrows and managed to complete this in 16.2 seconds, just a sliver faster than Yae Miko. The next victim, volunteer, is the terribly evil and terrifying Dodoko King. Not really. So we have our first situation where Yae Miko beat the Raiden Shogun. This is due to a couple of factors, with the main one being Yae's lack of downtime on her DPS. Yae's turrets provide a steady stream of reliable damage and have no downtime. As such, the Dodoko King's invincibility duration doesn't matter in the slightest against Yae Miko. She just waits for it to be vulnerable again and then unleashes her burst for a bit of extra DPS. And that's a flawless segue to Raiden's fight against the Dodoko King. I used Raiden's burst well before the Maguu Kenki became vulnerable. This allowed her to finish off the first form of Maguu Kenki with the tail end of her burst. And because I used her burst so early, this then allows her to use her second burst much more quickly than she otherwise could have. Once her burst was back up, the Dodoko King was no more. The local fireworks manufacturer's next, and she managed to actually beat both the Electro Spammers somehow. Yoimiya used a similar strategy as Raiden and precast her elemental skill, but thanks to Yoimiya's Constellation 4, her elemental skill's cooldown can be drastically shortened, which allows her to have minimal downtime on her fiery, murdery arrows. And after all those solo damage showcases, we have our very first team damage showcase. We'll be taking a full team to fight the Raiden Shogun with the Raiden Shogun. Anyway, I'm not going to think too hard about that. This was remarkably close between the three teams. An interesting tidbit about Yae is that she can be productive while moving forward by dropping turrets. Then, well, it's the usual buff the living carp out of an Electro DPS character with Bennett, Kazuha, and Sara, and the rest is history. Now you may have noticed that I didn't use Yae's elemental burst here. This is because I found that Raiden teleports around way too much. So just relying on the turrets to auto-target and hit her no matter where she is was by far the most reliable strategy I could come up with. And now it's time for Raiden versus Raiden, and this might shock you, but Raiden won.
What?
By using the same buffs that Yae's team did, Raiden did a huge initial slash by herself. Now I will say this was a huge pain in the you-know-where, and Raiden, the enemy Raiden, not my Raiden, will often teleport or even put her guard up and block attacks. Despite this not being a perfect run due to me using Kazuha's elemental skill, this was the best out of many attempts. Despite all the issues with this run, Raiden still beat herself the fastest in 12.3 seconds. As for Yoimiya, I tried using Yunjin many times, and unfortunately Yoimiya gets tossed around like a ragdoll with Yunjin. As such, I brought the thickest thing in Genshin Impact, Zhongli's astoundingly thick shield. While a drop in DPS, the reliability of his shield allowed Yoimiya to complete this in a very competitive 14.1 seconds. Now that the overall portion of this DPS showdown is finally over, we can finally take a look at how these three perform in the hardest content in the game, Abyss 12. In this video, I managed to do both the 2.4 Abyss 12 and the 2.5 Abyss 12 top halves with these characters. Let's start with the 2.4 Abyss 12, infamous for having two extremely durable boss fights. Now the full unedited runs for each of these characters will be in my Discord at discord.gg/IWTL, but since they're all so long, allow me to provide a summary. While Raiden won this by a significant margin, all things considered, Yoimiya and Yae were not that far behind. 12-1-1 is where Yoimiya absolutely shined and actually managed to get the W against both Raiden and Yae Miko. Yoimiya's kit is perfectly designed for the perpetual mechanical array, assuming you can one-cycle its first phase. The cooldown on Yoimiya's elemental skill lines up exceptionally well with when the robot add-on becomes vulnerable. And despite getting the crab robot, which has more hit points than the Dorito and snake robots, Yoimiya managed to beat this in a very impressive 25.9 seconds. Yoimiya was definitely assisted by the Abyssal Moon though, which provides 25% to all damage after a bunch of normal attacks hit the enemy. So with a combination of single target boss fights and a great Abyssal Moon for her, Yoimiya performed remarkably well for the entire top half of Abyss 12. Raiden is of course being as ruthless as ever, and she was able to one-cycle the Primo Geovishap even with Sara just using the Favonius Warbow. Raiden also had an extremely competitive time against the Perpetual Mechanical Array and was the fastest for 12.31. I think no one at this point is surprised by Raiden's stellar performance here. As for Yae, I actually think one of her highlights is that she was able to cleanly dispose of the first two robots with just her burst and a bit of support. This actually did shock me as I wasn't expecting her burst to be able to. Anyway, we can now finally move on from the Stone Age, that was 2.4's Abyss 12, and into the modern era with 2.5's Abyss 12. The top half of this Abyss 12 is quite simple, all things considered. With 12-1-1 having the Electro Doggos, Electro AoE characters do phenomenally well here. I'm certain that Raiden is able to complete this faster, but this gives us an idea of how quick she can complete this. Hey, so this is IWinToLose while editing. Some CN players have optimized Raiden's run down to 26 seconds without using glitches. Just want to let you guys know that my run here is far from perfect. I just didn't have the proper cards and my Sara does not do enough damage to perform the CN strategy for 12-1-1, which is the most important chamber. Anyway, back to pre-editing IWinToLose. As for 12-3-1, well, it's right for Raiden to quickly one-shot it and then move on with her life. Yae Miko's performance was fairly comparable to Raiden's, only being a few seconds slower. Yae has the unique advantage of being productive while moving towards the enemy. However, her burst takes a while for all the hits to come out, and by then, oftentimes Raiden has already murdered the enemy. Nonetheless, this was still an effortless clear by the penultimate Shrine Maiden. And I think it's to no one's surprise that Yoimiya did the worst here. The top half of Abyss 12 has no situation with just one target. I decided to use Xingqiu as the 4th slot with Yoimiya because other options like Yunjin and Zhongli were not able to one-cycle the 2 large doggos. Considering the multi-targeted nature of this Abyss 12 though, I actually think that Yoimiya did quite well. In particular, I really liked my run for 12-2-1. This approach utilized Yoimiya's range to its fullest as she guns down the tall robot on the other side of the map, and since the tall robot being so far away, this allowed Yoimiya to not need to dodge as much. And there is one more thing that I wanted to show you guys as well as probably answering one of your questions, and that is what happens when Yae and Raiden work together. As the saying goes, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. In both version 2.4 and the current 2.5 Abyss 12, Yae Miko does noticeably improve Raiden's times. It's me again, editing IWinToLose. So Raiden plus Yae doing better when combined isn't entirely accurate based on my early comment about how CN players managed to get 26 seconds with Hyper Raiden. Now I believe that Raiden plus Yae can theoretically get 25 seconds, 1 second saved on 12-1-1 and about half a second saved on 12-3-1, but I'll be darned if I grind 8 hours to make that happen, and frankly I need better cards for that. Anyway, for patch 2.5, Hyper Raiden and Raiden Yae I believe perform similarly, with perhaps Hyper Raiden being just slightly better overall, but yeah, that's just my 2 cents on this after the fact. So here is a summary of the results for this DPS showdown. It's undeniable that the current types of monsters and enemies favor nuking style characters like the Raiden Shogun. Raiden had an almost clean sweep of all the showcases in this video. And for the Primo Geovishap and Regisvine, she absolutely dominated. Outside of those though, the times were fairly competitive. Now I also wanted to showcase a scenario where Yae Miko absolutely dominates, and that is in Abyss 9-1-1. The enemies spawn all over the map and melee characters cannot hope to chase them all down. However, Yae's turrets kill everything in a huge radius at Constellation 2 and above, so this is perfect for her ridiculous turret range. Outside of this though, Yae spends way too much time casting her elemental skills, and her burst takes a while for all the lightning bolts to hit as well. At Constellation 6 Refinement 5, every second, heck, even every frame at times, matters for pushing speed running times. Despite all that, the fact that Yae Miko and Yoimiya were not outrageously behind Raiden clearly demonstrates their viability in my opinion. Let me know what you think about this DPS showdown. Did Yae Miko live up to her expectations? What do you think about Yoimiya's performance? As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is IWinToLose, signing out.